to see so many people here. I'm from Boyer, I'm the state president for AAA in Tasmania. And before we start, I want to pay respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and pay respect to their elders past and present. This land has been looked after by them, it has been nurtured by them, and their culture belongs to them, and we are lucky that they share it with us. This land always was, always will be, and has never been seen. Okay, welcome to people who are new to AIA. It's terrific to have you. Welcome to old faces, young faces, but who've been here a while. And we're really, really lucky tonight to have former Premier and former High Commissioner for Singapore, Hodgman, to join us. As well, welcome Vicky. Great to have you too. All of them need to be very special people. And I think that we will be lucky to have Will sharing some of his thoughts about Singapore, thoughts about transitioning from one small island to another very different small island. The last time I heard Will talk was as Premier, and he was at an event that was organised by Marcus and his colleagues at IMAX. It was an international conference about polar issues from the North Pole and Antarctica. And so this is a very different sort of world, although the temperature outside is probably a bit more like that. We'll probably need some more introduction process, so I'm just going to do a very fast track. Will was educated in Tasmania, studied law at the University of Tasmania, was the longest serving legal leader of the Tasmanian Parliament, which is something, and finally made it Premier, which was terrific, and was there for 6 years, six pretty stressful and whatever years. He then went to the business, business growth fund, and then was there only a very short time, so the growth must have happened very fast. When Will was co-opted to be High Commissioner for Singapore, I'm really interested in the legacy and the transition for both Will and Vicky and their families, and moving from a small state where you ran the show to another state organisation where you were Australian representative, but you had a lot of different sorts of negotiations to do. So, Will, over to you, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Kim, and thank you to the Institute for the invitation to speak to you this evening about one of the greatest loves in my life, alongside Nikki, that is the Republic of Singapore, and its very close, enduring connections to Australia. Before I do that, though, I also want to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners. And I did so almost every time I spoke in Singapore, albeit 4,000 kilometres away from Australia. I thought, and our new government has reinforced the need for Australia's diplomats across our global network to do so, to ensure that Australia's true story is told so that we can do our job as diplomats to build connections with a better understanding of the place from which we come. But it was done so with a sincere acknowledgement of the role of First Nations peoples in the place in which we live, and it's a delight for us to be back in Tasmania, albeit in slightly more Arctic feeling conditions. I must say we come back here with a great affection for this place and all its people. So sincere thanks to Kim and to all of you for your attendance tonight. I'll speak for a little while and then I'm certainly happy to answer any questions or perhaps move to areas not covered. There's a lot that can be said about Australia and Singapore's relationship. Whilst I've been back now for a couple of months, it feels like an age from when I was first appointed, in very troubling times for us all. But if I think back to the middle of January 2020, when it wasn't a sudden decision of mine, but there was a lot going on in international affairs. The UK formally separated from the European Union. Harry and Meghan formally separated from the royal family. Kim Jong-un was threatening brazenly to increase North Korea's nuclear capabilities. At that time, and coincidentally, then President Donald Trump sent him a birthday card, which I'm sure Kim appreciated, but he was swift to say that would not advance denuclearization talks. Vladimir Putin gave his presidential address and moved significant changes to Russia's constitution, which prompted then Prime Minister Medvedev and the cabinet of Russia to resign, saying that it could lead to catastrophic consequences. It was an uncertain time, and there was much happening, including for me personally, when after close to 18 years or so in Tasmania's parliament, and frankly feeling that there was little petrol left in the tank, it would be the right thing for me to move on. Just 10 days later, the World Health Organization announced what was then a state of emergency with a international public health warning, which of course just a few months later would be declared a global pandemic. The whole world went into lockdown, the global economy into recession. It was not a good time to be looking for a job or to be moving abroad. Kim mentioned that I was fortunate enough to pick up some work, not sure exactly what I would do, but when the invitation came to me by the then government, and I've often said in jest that perhaps one of former Prime Minister Scott Morrison's wiser decision was to appoint me to be our High Commissioner to Singapore. It was unexpected, and it was something at the time that we, and I very much include Nikki and our family, needed to think hard about. An enormous opportunity, and we concluded there would be no better opportunity than to undertake such a role in one of Australia's most important diplomatic posts in a very dynamic part of the world and our region, where our economic and our prospects now lie in Southeast Asia. So whilst it was a daunting proposition, it was an opportunity we felt too good to miss. A nightmare time, but a dream job. Now, the difficulty with appointments such as these is that they're not a simple thing. And the process the time between when you might be invited to take up a post, particularly when you come from my background, and as a political appointment, a non-career diplomat, the process by which your government and your host government must officially approve your appointment, agreement, can take some time. And by that I mean several months. Between then and when that occurs, and when the government of the day chooses to officially announce your appointment, you're expected to not tell anyone about it. Neither government will appreciate the news becoming public, may even be offended by it if it in fact occurs. So I was sworn to secrecy and feeling a sense of obligation, and embarking in a new line of work, I didn't want to fall at the first hurdle. So Nikki and I, for some months, were also unable to tell our family, our friends, most importantly our young children, that in the middle of a global pandemic we were planning to move abroad and take up a new life in Singapore. That was not an ideal way for us to mentally, emotionally, to personally equip ourselves to take up this role, and that process did take some months. It's obviously founded in well-established protocols and conventions, but practically it was not the ideal uplift for us, let alone in the conditions in which we found ourselves, which saw us in a near empty airport, us being Mickey, our youngest, still at school, Lily, our dog Maisie, near empty airports on a Singapore Airlines flight with more aircraft crew than passengers. It was an eerie and overwhelming experience. And then to land in a place also by then, some months after the pandemic had taken hold of the world, also in a state of lockdown, shutdown, limitations on social movements and interactions, to arrive at a High Commission with around 100 or so staff across all agencies, including locally engaged staff, all of which at various stages of their own personal journey through very difficult times. It was felt, and to some extent true to say, that it would not be easy. In fact, we were told it may not be possible for us to return to Australia. Fairly or not, there was a feeling that we may not be wanted back in Australia, and I say that on behalf of the hundreds of thousands of Australians across the world who felt that it would not be possible to return. And I started working with a group who'd been there for the entirety of the duration of the pandemic, and we were midway through it at that point. So the first thing we needed to do when I arrived was ensure that the health and welfare of our staff was paramount, and that we were doing all we could to support people who were stressed and distressed and unable to return to their home. So it was a slightly, I say this just to give you some context of the conditions in which I arrived in this role. A novice diplomat with very little training, some exposure to the work of our national government through the diplomatic networks and through our foreign services agencies, but still a very steep learning curve. A lot of what normally happens for diplomats with training and an ability to travel around the country and consult and engage with key stakeholders just couldn't happen. So I was very much thrown into the deep end. Fortunately, our then Secretary of the Department, who's now the Governor of South Australia, and when I was doing my old job was our Ambassador in China, I knew very well, and she wisely, and perhaps she said it's not always the case, paired me, a buddy in my Deputy High Commissioner, an excellent Foreign Service diplomat with a very strong, bright future, to allow us to ensure that the High Commission was being well served in these difficult times, and we had a blended skill set that maximised what I brought to the table, as limited as it may be, and her enormous expertise, and that is the team in Singapore that I was to work with. A relatively small one. People assume that Singapore, being one of our most important places, would be a large team, but the 100 people or so I refer to are across agencies. It's half the size, I think, of New Guinea, certainly a lot less than many other developing nations where the on-ground people resources are needed are much higher, but an excellent team, no doubt. So we arrived in this new country very well looked after, very well supported, a team under stress, and not a usual way of doing business. No ability to interact with the local community, to engage personally with leadership in government or at a political level. Very little ability to interact with Australians, many of whom were also similarly very distressed about the state of affairs, whether they'd be able to return home. Their businesses heavily affected by COVID. So it was a difficult time. We realised that it could not be business as usual, so we moved most of what we did online in digital ways. And I took a little from my old line of work, and as risky as it can be to use social media and digital platforms, it was our way of communicating with the people in Singapore who were our stakeholders. I took the opportunity where I could to engage very closely with the political leadership, and I think being Australia's first political appointment to Singapore gave me a point of difference and a point of interest to the political leadership there, which I know and they've told me was something that advantaged me in my role. And perhaps knowing that we spoke the same language and we understood the work context, despite unusual times, it gave me a great starting point, which I think fared well in the work we did out of the High Commission in getting some things done. And what those things were very practical. Singapore is always renowned as a place where things get done. They're very pragmatic, they're very effective and outcomes driven. So while our relationship is long-standing, well established and very trusted, there was a feeling that to keep it contemporary and to demonstrate the power of that connection through trust and an ability to interact and to effect positive outcomes, top of the list was to do all we could to ensure that the health and well-being of our citizens, both here and in Singapore, were the focus of government attention. With the vaccination rollouts, with the supply of technology and resources, the exchange of personnel, most famously, of course, our Tasmanian epidemiologist, Dale Fisher, working in Singapore, was one of the key advisors to the Singaporean government with enormously valuable connections here into Australia and Tasmania, of course. It was a really important collaboration between our health departments, and a little unusual for them to be so open in how they shared data, technology, the materials and the resources that we have were very much an open book for our governments to collaborate. As it was with travel, it's no easy thing in a global pandemic to contemplate how people might be able to safely travel between nations and across the world. Well, Australia and Singapore led the way. We shared technology, developed systems at our airports, in our immigration services to ensure a seamless and safe travel of people. So it didn't happen as quite as quickly as consumers would have liked, but we were the first in the world and Australia's first vaccinated travel lane, the first ability for foreigners to come to Australia was open for Singaporean students, a very important cohort. We also worked very closely on how we could support businesses, and there's a lot of information sharing on programs to support our tourism sector, our hospitality sectors, and our governments were really closely connected. My political connections helped because I had the phone numbers of our health ministers and our prime minister, our trade ministers, and was able to put not only their counterparts in touch, but to also ensure that Singapore was at the front of the queue for these collaborations, and to do so on behalf of our stakeholders, most notably Australians living in Singapore, but also Singaporeans in Australia, and those Singaporeans who wanted to come back into Australia to continue their education. A very important group, as I say. So that line of work, as I mentioned, not business as usual for a diplomat at all, but it was driven by necessity. And while all this was happening, Australia and Singapore struck what is the first in the world of the digital economy agreement, with an obvious shift, exacerbated, amplified by COVID, of course, to digital for trade, investment, and transactions, the move to more digital forms of doing business. We struck a digital economy agreement that, when I arrived, was in its implementation stages. Right in the middle of a global pandemic, and on one of the rare occasions when people could travel, Australia's Prime Minister Morrison travelled to Singapore and met Prime Minister Lee. This is an annual thing that happens between Australia and Singapore, quite unusual, but so important that it occurred throughout the pandemic. And from that meeting, an agreement for our nations to work on the global emergency of reducing climate change, reducing emissions, supporting a transition to the green economy, opening up enormous opportunities for those who work in sustainable ways, to trial what was then a groundbreaking agreement for Australia's shipping fleet, or the world's shipping fleet, to come from Australia, fueled by hydrogen, into the world's third largest shipping port in Singapore, and a decarbonised fleet port was the sort of the impetus for Australia and Singapore to collaborate. Both nations, perhaps, it was felt not doing as much as they might. This was another collaboration between our nations, sharing a sense of urgency to combat climate change, but also open up opportunities for trade and investment. Green economy agreement, first in the world of its kind. Prime Minister Albanese and the next Prime Minister of Singapore, Lawrence Wong, with Prime Minister Lee out of action, sadly due to COVID, met again in Singapore just a couple of weeks ago and added additional elements to that agreement. Now, this is a source of pride to me, because our High Commission and the excellent team in the High Commission in Singapore and a fantastic new division in Canberra were pivotal to developing this world's first agreement. And again, it's a demonstration of the close bond and connection between our nations. Many other things happened in the time I was there. Singapore went from being Australia's 7th largest trading partner to a 5th, despite the global recession. Enormously important trading partner. We struck a new defence pact for Australia and Singapore to collaborate in ways that no other nations can. Singapore is one of the few places, in fact one of only two nations that is able to operate sovereign capabilities in Australia. Around 4,000 Singaporeans train with the military in Australia. Every single Air Force pilot from Singapore spends time flying across our expansive skies, where in Singapore they can't. This is a very, very trusted and deep-seated connection between our nations, and it's very important to both our nations' security. And that expands now into other areas like cyber security, continued efforts to prevent, to counter terrorism, to counter foreign interference. It was another area that was new to me and very striking in its importance. Australia's domestic security depends very much on our partnership with Singapore, and our respective defence forces and security agencies are very, very closely connected in most unique and very important ways. There were many other things that we were able to achieve despite the difficult times. I think on reflection, when I look back and appreciate what I learned, it was an enormous opportunity for me, and I'm immensely grateful for that. I certainly gave the job as much as I could, and I think we have a lot to be proud of. But the things that really stood out to me personally, there's no doubt that Singapore, as I say, is a very special place. It's a fascinating place to live. It's a tiny island, the size of one of the Greater Hobart municipalities, yet an economic powerhouse. It is a developing parliamentary democracy. It is quite immature in its progress, in that it's only been operating for some decades, and for many people, quite a punitive and unforgiving justice system. It's a place that's often the subject of some criticism for its position on law and legal systems, the death penalty, caning of offenders. It was only in the time I was there that they decriminalised homosexual activity, and I know Tasmanians have often thought that we were behind the times. I think it's the late 90s that Tasmania moved on from that, but in Singapore it was only in the last year or so. But despite that, it's an amazing place to live. It's very safe, it's very clean. They have very high education and health outcomes, magnificent food, and it's a very special place to live. And they guard that with great importance and priority. They're very alert to their vulnerabilities. In the pandemic, they were suddenly exposed by a lack of food supply. Tiny island nation, its borders shut. They looked to Australia for us to supply food. So while we were able to get Australians back into Australia, not only from Singapore but right across the world, we were able to reciprocate by getting our fresh produce into Singapore. Energy security is a real issue. They have no natural resources, let alone the ability to produce and generate energy supply. That's why they look to Australia as a place to be a source for alternative and sustainable fuel sources like hydrogen or ammonia. The planned sun cable, which has contemplated the building of a 4,700 kilometre cable from the Northern Territory to Singapore, is a project not without its challenges, but one that both our governments are looking very closely at. And they are always very alert to their own security challenges, being a tiny island. They look to Australia to supply what they can't as a trusted partner, and they look to us with a trust and affection like no other. Australia was one of the first nations to recognise Singapore's sovereignty. We were the last to leave when Singapore was being invaded in 1942 by the Japanese, and many thousands of Australians interned in Changi. They value and respect Australians like no other nation. We don't take that for granted, and it's something that our governments are very aware of and respectful of, but mindful that it really should be the foundations for greater things and greater collaboration. But amongst all, I often reflected on the very close connections between our people as the greatest of all those links, and the foundation for the enduring connection between Australia and Singapore, and principally through education. Through the Colombo Plan and more recently the new Colombo Plan, 5,000 Singaporeans educating themselves in Australia each year. I've mentioned the 4,000 who are doing so in Singapore's Defence Forces. 200,000 Singaporeans who've been through Australia's universities. 1,000 of them from UTAS, a very vocal, proud bunch. Part of this alumni that I used to often say forms what are our best ambassadors. They're so affectionate about our nation. Many of these people have moved on to very significant positions of influence in business, in government, and within the Singapore system. 2 of Singapore's 8 presidents were educated at Adelaide University. And it was through those connections that it wasn't hard when I picked up the phone to Singaporean ministers, or when I had them round for dinner to talk about Australia and their fondness for it. It is without doubt the most meaningful, intimate and enduring connections between our countries. And I think the foundation for all of those things that I've spoken about tonight, which I was fortunate enough to be a part of for a short while, and very proud and grateful to have witnessed. So thank you again to the Institute. I hope that's been of some interest. There are so many other things I'd like to talk about, but while my old role I was given as long as I wanted to speak, I'm mindful that I shouldn't go on, and perhaps there are other subjects that may be of interest to you, so I'm more than happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Will. Any questions? James, I thought you were short. Oh, sorry.
If you
Yeah. Yeah, I'll be a little facetious perhaps, but while Australians might look to Singapore's systems, and I say very respectfully as their parliamentary democracy is less advanced, they don't have an opposition, they don't have the distractions that we might have, a very active media. They look at what we do with some amusement occasionally, but I was very encouraging of them and their political system to evolve in ways that I think predominantly are a positive element of Australian and modern contemporary Western democracies. But conversely, when I come back here, and admittedly they have one tier of government, they don't have the distractions of the being a little cheeky to which I refer. They're able to get things done very quickly, effectively, without too much delay, and usually with very impressive results. I mean, I think of urban development, their progress in education, in research, scientific endeavour, world leading. The quality of life there is incredible for a country that 75 years ago was a swamp. The transformation of that place, you see it before your eyes, is incredible. So if we could bring back some of that system, I think that would be perhaps helpful. But it doesn't come without its challenges, and I think they don't get much wrong, but there are areas for improvement. But it's a very impressive place. The other thing that I'm sure many of you will appreciate, and I'll say this, knowing that the feeling may extend to my good self or those with whom I used to work in Singapore, they're very adept at identifying people who are suitable to take on leadership roles. Many of their parliaments, the leaders within their bureaucracy are handpicked, well trained, and given often there's a turnover of exceptional individuals who hold these leadership positions, but they manage to ensure that their institutions are filled with very capable and competent people. So again, I'm not suggesting this would be so, but there might be some of you feeling I wish we could do a little more of that in Australia's parliaments, perhaps, if not our state service. So no judgment.
Well, speaking of that, I found that very, very interesting. They're absolutely terrific. But what I really like to know, and I know I've been things that are 6 to 10 years and the big obviously, the Premier of Tasmania is extraordinary. But while you're there, and on a very domestic level, what should you identify that Tasmania should be totally around and
Yeah, it's a great question, and I had to remind myself that I was an employee of the Australian government, not the Tasmanian one, but there's so many ways that Tasmania can benefit from this connection. In so many areas, as I say, I mean, Singapore isn't perfect. They've got fairly poor environmental standards. The use of single-use plastics, for instance, and the burning of waste, is an area where they need help, they need assistance. They're exceptional at managing their water resource, which is often recycled multiple times, and things like that. But in areas of sustainability, renewable energy, our technical expertise in Tasmania is second to none. I think there's enormous appetite for our produce. The difficulty we'll always have here is the volume, but there's increased interest in Australian produce, and Tasmania's at the forefront of that, I would say, unashamedly and quite objectively. So an ability to get our produce there. And I do think the exchange of educational expertise is an area of some interest to Singapore. Again, areas where they're deficient, they perhaps don't plan so well. 90% of Singapore's nursing profession are trained overseas. They're construction workers who build what are some of the world's most impressive buildings are all foreign workers. Neither group well supported during the pandemic, and there were serious human rights issues again where Singapore was found to be deficient. But they have vulnerabilities, so areas where Australia and Tasmania especially can support the development of a skills base that is able to better leverage against future events like a pandemic is something that Singapore's looking closely at. Nicky's University, which she still works, James Cook University, Australia's largest university presence in Singapore, which is surprising, and there are other major universities there, and they've got a long-standing connection with very cleverly identified areas where Singapore is deficient and where they need assistance in tropical fisheries, for one, and certain medical areas of practice. I think there are ways we can help fill some of those gaps. Yeah, I'd hope so. Another great irony, I used to go to Singapore in my old job because Singapore's Capital Infrastructure Trust owned Basslink Cable between Melbourne and Tasmania, which famously was severed when I was Premier. We had an energy crisis for 6 months and ended up in litigation, so I'd have to go to Singapore and argue with them about that. Direct flights was always something I spoke to Singapore Airlines and subsidiary companies about. I believe we're still close to that, but it's not been a great time for the aviation industry, so it's perhaps not going to be a longer term thing, but it would be fantastic, and that's something that would open up Tasmania in ways like none other. I have to say though, knowing as a former tourism minister, that some of our highest yielding tourists, longest staying tourists are Singaporeans. Again, they're very astute, and they know they're going to come this far. They'll stay here for longer, they'll hire cars and drive around more of the state. They're the ones we may occasionally see about, but they do that more than any other visiting international, so they're a very important tourist cohort. They're visiting friends and relatives who come out to see their kids at universities across Australia, and many UTAS here are a very important group as well.
When you were looking at the reflection on life working in Australia diplomat overseas at that time, my colleagues, particularly the tennis area of that so yeah, in Australia was the personal challenge of the people who are in the tennis overseas. But I also was sitting on that same line, I wanted to ask, many reflected on how Australia is viewed internationally during the pandemic in relation to our very strict COVID. What did it seem like from Singapore, and what how did the Singaporeans see it?
Yeah, and on our diplomats, and that was the other takeout for me from this experience, was the incredible people who work with our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and other agencies. They do what we did every 3 years or so, and the enormous upheaval for families, the commitment that people make, and spouses to do it every 3 or 6 years is impressive. And they're super intelligent. There are no more competent, passionate, committed people working overseas than people in our foreign service, and some of the best of them were in Singapore. But it's interesting because we saw a lot and tuned into how Australia was faring on our COVID journey, and how it's been perceived by others. Certainly our domestic community, Australian citizens, were very frustrated with Australian government policy regarding travel. We did it 3 times and 14 days of quarantine in hotels. Yeah, it's not. It's not fun. So they were a group whose attitudes to how it was going here were front and centre for us, and it did become quite acerbic, you might say. It was fairly unpleasant. Sense of uncertainty, of anxiety, not knowing how long, how deep the pandemic might go. It was a difficult time. I feel, given who I was in my background and the fact that we were quite overtly communicating through social media and digital platforms, we were a bit of a lightning rod to that. But the Singaporean government, this is the interesting thing, watched Australia very closely, and we're at similar stages in our vaccination rollout. Singapore moved quickly. It's a much smaller population, 5 million or so. So they were able to move through quickly. Australia eventually caught up. But we're at similar stages, you might say, in terms of social distancing and the restrictions that were placed on travel in some states more than others. That was something that they couldn't get their heads around, and was a source of some frustration because Singapore wanted to open up travel a lot earlier than Australia did, principally for the students, but also for those visitors who like coming here and visit people who form part of that fifth largest trading partnership in the world. So they were a little frustrated by that and expressed that to me as well, the other group of active constituents. But they watched Australia move out, they thought, very swiftly from those lockdowns into opening up. They thought, what a strange pace. Some states had no cases and they're in lockdown. Suddenly the pandemic takes hold and there are many people with COVID, and our country opens back up again. It gave Singapore and their political leadership the confidence to move, and they followed shortly thereafter. So I guess to answer your question, I don't think some of the issues that we saw in other parts of the world about Australia were the same, but it was very instructive in how they watched what we were doing, and Dale Fisher did become literally a sort of chief advisor on how things might play out. So it was a nice connection again with Australia's medical system. It was a fascinating thing, the political evolution of thought and the political courage, I guess, to open up, which thank heavens I never had to worry about.
Amid all of that, there's the geopolitical swerve of Singapore within ASEAN, the tensions between the development of bodies like the Crown or AUKUS and so on. What reflections can you offer us about the experience of that swerve in your time there?
Yeah, and so many facets to it. I've alluded to some of the security elements, and they include concerns about what's happening in China Sea or Taiwan Strait, and what could happen, what's happening in Ukraine, the coup in Myanmar. These things Singapore is very alert to, and as is the rest of the world. But for them, they're open, very alert and aware of their vulnerabilities and exposures as a small nation geographically. So the interesting thing for us is that they look to Australia as a key partner to assist in smoothing out some of those geopolitical tensions. And that includes, they hoped, with China, and that's happening, and they're very pleased about that. And that's for various reasons. The historical, cultural connections, 70% of Singaporeans with Chinese culture cultural heritage. They're number one trading partner. Singapore is the largest investor in the world of any nation in China. So they're, to be fair, they're again very pragmatic about it, but they like to be able to happily sit on the fence and not take sides. The Americans, their benefit is ensuring that they have the defence capability in and around them and our region, which is why Singapore also enjoys very special, particular defence arrangements with the Americans, the US, and that helps provide some stability and security in our region. But they don't always like the way America goes about its business either. In a number of ways, during my time, it heightened concern amongst the Singaporean leadership. Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, but via Singapore, placed the spotlight right on Singapore, which they did not appreciate. There are tensions which Singaporeans and Americans have that we don't quite have. So they look to us to try and guide Americans in their responses, which is, something that our foreign ministers are intrigued by, and no doubt prepared to do what we can, but it's a big job. So, yeah, it's a fascinating time. Singapore is less threatened by the Quad, by AUKUS. They're very supportive of it. They used to be more exercised about the Quad because it destabilised the settings a little and felt provocative, and wondered why our political narrative was so strong. And our media, again, they look to the way our systems here often amplify issues about China, and they basically wonder why it was so vocal, whereas they prefer things to be handled more judiciously. But they do look to us, again, with trust and confidence that we might be able to play a positive role in helping to diffuse some of those geopolitical tensions as best we can.
Yes. I read somewhere that Singapore is project around China. How is that?
Sorry, Mr.
Singapore is project around China. So how does that sit with democracy? Is it like Taiwan democracy, or are they democratic, or are they? I don't really understand.
Yeah, well, they are. I mean, I think they're very much parliamentary democracy. As I say, less developed might be an unfair description, but they don't have an effective opposition. Effectively, that there is a recognised opposition. It's only been recognised since the last elections. President's membership, there are a number of women in the parliament slowly increasing. There are areas where there's room for improvement. But they go to elections every 5 years, like us. But many keen observers would look, I think, to Singapore as a place where there could be more improvements to its systems of democracy. But citizens, there's the rule of law. They do have things like the death penalty. They are able to incarcerate people without charge. There are things that cause Australia's government some concern, and we will identify those when they're appropriate.
To tell you how young Singapore is, I was 10 years old and Singapore became a republic. So in that span of my life, it's become very urbanized, very progressive. By the way, I miss Singapore a lot, okay?
So do I.
Yeah. So a lot of people don't know that
Medicare system is copied by top, and our super funds is copied by Paul Keating. So we are more advanced than we think. But I do admit that our human rights is appalling.
I think it's incredibly advanced in so many areas.
And you are not Australian either, because they kept telling me your Tasmanian boy is now an icon. And then your Dale Fisher is our Dr. God.
Yes.
Is God. I'm not joking. So I said, look here, Tasmania is part of Australia, but they're just Tasmanian, they're still not all things to them. I think you don't know that. So I have to, but of course, with your peers, with your competitors from Australia, but my friends, my family, my old neighbors still call you. Just somehow it's not Australian.
Yeah, no, it helped put our island on the map as well. The synergies between two small islands, I think they appreciate. But you're right, that's one of the challenges for our tourism agencies, is to say a lot more Australian than Sydney Harbour. So that's, it's great, because I love it.
I'm not allowed to lose my English.
No.
Because I'm the first generation Singaporean, so I always keep this English. But once in a while, if somebody hear a British accent with American English, then I quickly have to cover it, because I don't want to lose this English. People kept quiet on the train. The minute I opened my mouth, that's the first generation Singaporean.
No, we love it. The culture, the food, it's wonderful. Yeah, the people love it.
Just wondered about, Malaysia and Singapore are so intertwined.
Yeah.
What do you see with the new leadership in Malaysia in the coming? Is it the passing away of the Lee dynasty?
Yes. Yeah, it's a fascinating dynamic, and Singaporeans have effectively anointed Lawrence Wong as the Deputy Prime Minister, as their next Prime Minister. Some say that might be as early as next year, mid-term, before their next election is due. He and Lee was, I think, hoping like me to get out a little earlier, but circumstances intervened. He didn't get out just before COVID. I didn't know it was happening, by the way, for those who feared that much. But it'll be a seamless transition. And this is another way where Singapore's parliamentary system, many people would welcome that. They can't believe we changed prime ministers overnight. In Singapore, it takes years to do it. And some wonder about the diversity of that, and even whether another Lee might take that way. But Lawrence Wong, who would be excellent, is it. But Malaysia, that's one of the fascinating tension points in Southeast Asia and ASEAN. Very interdependent. 200,000 Malays come across in good times when the borders are open to working in Singapore. It's a very place for Singaporeans to visit and do so across the causeway. There'll be an MRT train. Part of the train network will take people across to Malaysia. So it's a very important place in the section between two nations that have a troubled history, and the Singaporeans haven't forgotten that. And are often reminded again of their vulnerabilities and some of the security issues to which I refer. The Malays are chopping off their energy, water supplies, food supplies, chicken, which in Singapore was a national tragedy for chicken rice. So thankfully Australia came to the rescue and enabled Western Australian chicken producers to get their chooks up into Singapore, but that was a national tragedy for them. So they're very mindful and very wary about what's happening in Malaysia. One of the interesting historical quirks is that we have a firepower defence arrangement, which includes Singapore, Australia, the UK, and Malaysia and New Zealand. In Malaysia, it's an odd arrangement. The historical quirk of fate, but it's so important to keep Malaysia in the tent and part of the team, because Singapore is literally anxious that they might be invaded or attacked by Malaysia, even now. And with some justification, when you see what's happening in Ukraine or Taiwan or Myanmar, they feel that they're not careful. So that's why Australia's defence arrangements are so important. Their ability to train their Air Force here, because if they come within an inch of Malaysia's airspace, they've got a problem. It's that serious. So they watch very closely what's happening there, and I think it would be fair to say amongst their areas of interest, not concern, Malaysia would be one of them.
Before I could James ask this question, I just want to put in a plug for Colin James Tim. This is Tim. This is expert on Malaysia and Malaysian politics. And he has a great, on the AIA national website, the YouTube site, he has a excellent talk about the results of the elections. Our colleagues from AIA was persuaded, so I would recommend that. It's interested in that area. Now, Jim, you can ask the
Sure.
No.
So my question is fairly straightforward. We know that increasingly in the last 10 years, more and more Australians are actually starting their careers in Singapore. They're working on local contracts. Can you tell us something about the Australian community who are living permanently in Singapore?
Yeah.
How big is the numbers?
Back in the pre-COVID days, there was thought there are close to 30,000 Australians living in Singapore. I think we know, but not everyone needs to identify that fact or wants to, and it can be quite transient. But that's as high as it was. I was told that during COVID, the largest cohort of expat of any nation out of Singapore back home was Australia, and I think it was because of the fact that there was a sense that maybe if you could get back and stay back, it was going to be hard. So they reckon that number's probably hard, but it's coming back very quickly, including from other places like Hong Kong, where there are business opportunities for people who work in financial services sectors, etc. So it's coming back up, but if you look at anecdotal levels with our Australian International School, talk to major Australian companies that are there, they have a lot of left, and it may be needed a bit of recalibrating. The interesting thing about it was, and Singapore unashamedly have quite distinct settings on their immigration policies. People come in and out of the country from where they come. In Australia, you might almost feel it's discriminatory. And they have in their legal, their constitution, how many people from which ethnic origin can live in Singapore, and that also extends to foreign workers coming in, and they'll manage and control very carefully what your rights to employment are. Easy for me, diplomat, but for other people who want to work for a company, there are a lot of hurdles to jump over before you can come and work there. And they took the COVID opportunity to reset that a little too, with mind to the future and what they need. And we'd have Australians complaining, so I want to go and work for ANZ or BHP and I can't get a pass, can you help? And the Singaporeans, so we're going to make it tougher for Aussies and Brits and Americans. Just it's a tiny island, 5 million, it's pretty crowded. So when we made representations about that, they said, well, don't think we're going to go back to what it was in the financial services sector, professional services. We need other services and people with different skill sets, and that includes in the digital and green economies. That's where the party's going, so if you want to be in it, they're the sort of people we want. I take no issue with that. It's becoming increasingly, incredibly expensive to live in Singapore now. Domestic rental prices have doubled. It was 100% in the time that we were there, and cheap to start with. I'm told that the favourable tax arrangements are becoming negligible now. If you've got kids, young kids at schools there, it's almost become prohibitive. So I think there will be some issues, but the other thing is what's happening in Hong Kong, and they really have a captive market in Singapore. There's no other place in Southeast Asia that has the security and stability, the commercial infrastructure and environment in which you can place a business and do some of the world's most important trade then there. They know that they've got the field covered for a while. It was fascinating to watch the government quite effectively pull levers to manage the flow of immigrants or foreign workers.
For the information for this year, we've got a great program lined up for the rest of the year, thanks to our colleagues from the University of Tasmania. So we've got the resources for the joint event of Indigenous sovereignty and how it works in other countries and other jurisdictions. And we've been doing that early in August. Resources lined up for us, Sean Purnell, to give the Kindergarten this year for a about inside that. The programs on nuclear disarmament, we've got more programs on Antarctica and the role of Camelot nuclear clinic. So we've got a really rich program. So if you want to remember, please join us. We also have some really skilled government process.
Wow.
So we'll make sure that we invite you to that. But I'm not sure if I guess it can be said Trump and the rating of the capital. So after that, I want to say thank you to it was great for me. We have family connections that go back a long way, but I have never heard before quite as eloquently as this before. When you're a politician, you don't get the chance often to talk about the heart. Sorry, eloquent.
Yeah.
It's about talking from the heart. The sense of your love and respect for Singapore and your role is, I think, really wonderful. And I think that carry it forward. And thanks. I think it's about
No, absolutely not.
so thanks.